Hello everyone, you're very welcome to my class. So I'm a mathematician and I'm going to discuss about a topic in mathematics. For today I'm going to introduce you an inverse function, one of the favorite things in mathematics. But what's the inverse function? An inverse function is a function that we undo whatever a function does. Imagine that I'm standing here and I'm going to have a seat on the ground. So the way that I'm going to have a seat on the ground, let's call it function. But what's the inverse of this function? Standing and getting off of the ground. It's the inverse function of sitting on the ground. So this one is a kind of a real function, real inverse function. But what about the inverse function in mathematical point of view? So let's define a function like fx equal to x plus 5. For any x, if we want to find the fx at that special case of x, for example x4, what would happen to the x? What would happen to the x? So x would be multiplied by 2 and then subtract 5. Sorry, and it will be added some 5 to that last point, you know. So the two operations that is dealing with to calculate the function fx is multiplication and addition. So it's very clear. But what's the operations that will play a role in finding the inverse function of this function? What's your suggestion?
Division.
What's the two other operations that will play a role in finding inverse function of this function? So as I said, for calculating the function, multiplication and addition play the role. But what about the inverse function? It should be division and subtraction. Because division will undo whatever the multiplication did, and subtraction will undo whatever addition operation did for the function. So before going to the next step for finding an inverse function of this very simple function, let's define and find the criteria to be sure that a function does a function have an inverse or not. Because there are many functions that they don't have any inverse function. So finding something that in real there isn't, it's a kind of wasting time. So we have to be sure that a function that we are trying to find the inverse of that function has an inverse function, you know. So we have to introduce a concept to guarantee the existence of that inverse function. So what's the criteria? describing the criteria, I have to introduce the concept of one-to-one function. So you may ask me, what's the one-to-one function? Because you're not a mathematician. So, one-to-one function. In a simple word, I have to say that a function is a one-to-one function if any distinct value of domain of x goes to distinct value of codomain of f. Domain, codomain. It means if x goes to y1, x cannot go to y1, you know? This function is a one-to-one function. But there is a very simple criteria to define the one-to-one function, and it's called horizontal line. So imagine we have a function like this. We want to be sure that this function is a one-to-one function. So one-to-one function by horizontal line test. Horizontal line test means we can draw different kind of horizontal line. So if the lines didn't cut the function more than 1 point, that function is a one-to-one function. For example, this one is a one-to-one function because for any horizontal line that you are cutting the function by black line, the line will cut the function exactly at 1 point. But for this function, is not a one-to-one because for any, we find at least two lines, vertical and horizontal line that is cutting the function f at more than 1 point. So that f is not one-to-one function. So let's go back to the main goal of this class. We want to find the inverse function, and we describe about the criteria to be sure that a function has an inverse. So by the horizontal line test, we can be sure that this function, because when you plot this function is like this, like this, and when you cut the function with horizontal line, the cut point is just 1. So we are sure that this function has an inverse function, and we want to calculate the inverse of this function. How we calculate it? So let's call fy as y to x plus 5, and then find an x from here. So this one is equal to y over 2 minus 5, 2.5. So as I said before, the operations that is playing a role in an inverse function, it should be division and subtraction. You know, it's very interesting. So that's the definition of inverse function, and we know that how to calculate the inverse function, and then just change the name of x and y. So we can say that this one is y and x over 2 minus 2.5. This function is an inverse function of the original function. That's it. So if you have any question about that,